Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never practice nunchucks in a crowded room. Never eat chole before a road trip. Always take your shirt off before you iron it. Don't take a call near a swimming pool. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Think of the challenge I face for today's episode of Cut the Clutter. So right now, look at the state of the world. Two wars are on. We know one in the Middle East, the second in Ukraine, in Europe. One diplomatic skirmish is on, that is India and Canada. One diplomatic argument is on, that is between India and the US. At the same time, the BRICS summit is taking place. And yet, almost on the same day, in the same 48 hours, while these two wars have been raging, peace has also broken out. That's between India and China on the line of actual control. On top of this, if this is not enough, in less than 2 weeks from now, we are going to see a new president in the US, whether it's from the Democratic Party or Republican Party, we don't know. And the fact that even now it is such a close fight tells you how many uncertainties govern today's world. That's the reason I thought, instead of me just reading up and trying to make sense of it, I will get real experts to help. Real experts, also two wonderful young women you read on ThePrint with very well-informed views, both domain specialists who have expanded their reach. There is SanaHashmi, who's joined us from Taiwan. SanaHashmi, as you can imagine, is a specialist on China, knows the language. You follow her column. Swasti Rao, whose column has also evolved, because just as Sana is a China specialist, Swasti started out being a Japan specialist. If you go to a Twitter handle, you can see words in Japanese written there, as you might see in Chinese from Sana. Swasti has focused a lot more on Europe lately, on Europe and also the big power balance and the big power equations. Now, the point is, the reason we are looking at this state of the world now is that just as there is a lot of tamasha going on, there is a lot of dhakka-mukhi going on in this world, it's also opening up a lot of spaces. So many other countries are seeing the room for maneuver, which means this is also seeing the rise of swing states. And India is a swing state. So Swasti, will you tell us how you see India as a swing state?
I mean, India as a swing state or India as a consequential hedger, country that is constantly hedging its bets. I think, from the perspective of India, that is still a rather middle order country in terms of, how it's placed in the global system. I think on the one hand, it makes sense to keep our options open. So as far as keeping the options open is concerned, I think multi-alignment is a good tool. But I think India needs to have a better sense of what its end is, in the sense that what its objective is. If the objective is comprehensive national power and power maximization, then we also need to sort of have that modus operandi to get there. I sometimes feel that as a consequential hedger, while it makes sense on the one hand, because it's very commonsensical, I do sometimes see that often there is a contradiction or a confusion between means justified ends or end justifies means. So there's too much, focus on multi-alignment, which I personally think should be a means to get to a particular.
Yeah. So it's not as if you get obsessed with multi-alignment that you don't align on any side in specific situations as
True.
well.
I mean, multi-alignment is for the sake of something. Multi-alignment is not an end unto itself.
That's
the point that I'm trying to make.
That's a good point. Sana, I know that the Chinese see it very differently. Your latest column, in fact, you said even on BRICS, the Chinese see India actually has a problem there, because India is the moderating force. India in a way challenges China's domination there. How does that play out? And also, where do Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping go now after their summit today and after this relative thaw on the line of actual control?
Yeah, and then I agree with Swasti, but I think I also disagree with her on a few points, specifically on multi-alignment, that how India has to really draw a line and fence sitting is something that is not going to work in the long term. But I do believe that as of now, India doesn't really have a lot of options. India has issues with China, and India cannot really fully trust the West. So where do you go from here? So I feel that perhaps in the current scenario, this is something that India has to practice. But now coming to China. Uh, India is definitely the most effective counterbalance to China. And this is something that China has accepted, China has acknowledged as well, at least within the strategic community and the media discourse. So, this is something that we have seen. And there are evidences. The US is primarily looking at India to counterbalance China. And Indo Pacific exists primarily because of India today. So definitely, it's not in China's interest to see India growing. And even when China and India are being part of organizations such as Shanghai Cooperation Organization as well as BRICS, and we saw how there was such hoopla around surrounding BRICS today, and even Xi Jinping, Prime Minister Modi visit. Um, no matter what we are seeing today with respect to Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi meeting is definitely a very, very good development. It was long overdue. They last time they met was in 2019, and being the leaders of the two largest countries in the world, they had to meet. This is the policy of India as well, that the channel of communication need to be open. We need to talk to China. Of course, the highest level leadership meeting wasn't really happening. So I do believe it was long overdue, but then where do we go from now? Are we really going to see a reset in the relationship? I do not really see that. It's definitely a breakthrough, specifically after 4 years of negotiation, 4 years of meetings at different levels, military establishment, Ministry of External Affairs, special representative talks. But despite that, I do not really see anything that has changed on the ground. We have to wait and see, uh, does China really pay attention to what are India's legitimate concerns? Is China definitely going to do anything that eases tensions with respect to India? As of now, I don't see that. But of course, the meeting has just happened today. The difficult task is lies with the officials. So we have to really wait and watch and see how it pans out in the long term.
Well, Sana, 4 years, 4.5 years is actually an improvement. It's an improvement of at least 50% because last time we had trouble at Sumdurungchu, it took 9 years. So now it's taken exactly half that much time. Except in that case, everybody went back also. In this case, people troops are not going back, heavy stuff is not going back. So both of you, if I may ask you, Swasti, you first. Why would China relent at this point of time? उनको क्या फर्क पड़ता है? Terrain is easier on their side. They built roads. They built those villages. They have more energy produced on their side to heat their locations. They know India is not going to invade them, right? So why have the Chinese now relented, you think?
Well, I mean, there are 3-4 factors. Obviously, we don't really have a very clear-cut binary answer in a binary as to this is what it is and this is what it is not. But I think there are 3-4 factors here which catch everybody's attention, and especially those that are doing strategic studies in India's foreign policy, etc. I think on the one hand, we can perhaps say that it was easier for China to actually let this happen because also in the last 4 years, there's been very aggressive infrastructure development. Okay, so come to think of it, do they really need? They can allow for this little disengagement. Okay, for the troops to go back unless they are not reducing them significantly because the other clutches have tightened, isn't it, with respect to the infrastructure modernization. So I guess perhaps it's relatively simpler in that sense.
On the Indian side or on the Chinese side?
On the Chinese side. I mean, on the Indian side, we have done enough infrastructure development as well. But the Chinese side infrastructure development is I would say, very serious in the last 4 years.
So they can come in anytime they want.
I mean, they don't really need to sort of be there all the time in person because the infrastructure has already been developed, and in a very aggressive manner. And as far as I know, I think they have no plans of slowing down their infrastructure development either. So I think the one part is coming from there. The other part is that, there's some people saying that perhaps China doesn't want its attention to be divided right now, and perhaps Taiwan is something which is right now catching its attention. So perhaps they want to really look at Taiwan. I mean, it's not really an argument that I would really buy with that, with the same alacrity, but nonetheless, this is one argument as well. The third one would be that yes, this is also a good time for the Chinese economy since it's it's not doing very well. And India is looking at certain investments. So this perhaps could come in lieu of China giving some investments to India that we've been looking at. And not the 5G perhaps, but also something like on the EVs, etc. So we're looking at that. So perhaps this could be a kind of a, coexistence and trying to manage the tensions, which honestly is an ideal outcome if China is serious about honoring those CBMs that are put in place. If that is happening, then of course it's a very welcome step.
Sana, why do you think have the Chinese relented? Because they could have just stayed there for a very long time. It was much tougher for us because terrain being what it is, because India has to go through very difficult mountains to get there, because this is the plateau zone. The Chinese side is plateau. And plus, they have much better infrastructure. They've been building it for a very long time. They also have a lot more resources. So why did the Chinese have to do this?
I believe that the boundary dispute has never been about the territory. It is not about the military capabilities of India and China and how China has an upper hand. I believe that it is primarily about how India has been siding in how China sees it with the US and with the West. Because if we go back in 2017-18, after Doklam standoff, India, who was considered a weak link in the quadrilateral security dialogue, actually became one of the strongest proponents of the Indo-Pacific and the Quad, the Indo-Pacific consultations. And then we saw what happened after that. In 2019, the informal summits took place, 2018 and 2019. So the request for the informal summits came from the Chinese side. And at that point of time also, the reason was that India was aligning closer to the US. So in Chinese strategic thinking, US is the primary threat. US is the primary adversary. And US is building this anti-China coalition in which India is a very, very important and crucial component. So how do you weaken this coalition? So I think this is the strategy that we have been seeing for a very long time. So with the Modi administration, the approach towards the boundary dispute, approach towards China is totally different from what we have seen before. For the very first time in the past 5-6 years, what we are seeing is that the boundary dispute is at the forefront. This entire idea that the boundary dispute has to be left on the next generation of leadership, has to be put on the back burner, this is something that we are not seeing right now. Even though the meeting has happened today, it doesn't mean that the boundary dispute is just going to be on the back burner. It's just a meeting. It's a standard procedure. It's just a thing that, the two leaders have to sit together and talk about the boundary dispute. But it doesn't mean the Indian side is just going to focus on investment. It's not going to be business as usual for sure. So I do believe that the US is definitely one of the important factors. And then I think the timing is so important for China right now. The US is going to have elections in less than 2 weeks. So there will be transition in the US as well. And no one actually knows who's going to win in the US and how it is going to be different for India, for China. And Swasti also mentioned about Taiwan. And I do agree that this is not the primary reason, but it is definitely a contributing factor, because how India-Taiwan relations have changed specifically since 2020, 2021. And I always say that India is one country that perhaps doesn't use Taiwan as a card. India knows that the relationship with Taiwan stands on its own merit. There is economic complementarity, so we have to engage Taiwan. But the change in perception, the change in outlook with respect to China enabled India to see Taiwan in the new light. The idea that we do not have to respect Beijing's red lines, we do not have to see what China wants from us because there is no one India policy from their side. We do not really have to respect one China policy. But also Taiwan was never a part of India's one China policy adherence. But I do believe specifically after what has happened since 2021 with respect to India-Taiwan relations and recently the opening of the new office in Mumbai, this is something that is perhaps making China concerned about how this relationship between India and Taiwan is going to pan out in the near future. So if we do not really reach out to the Indian side, perhaps because India definitely needs more investment at this point, and Taiwan is one of the important countries when it comes to seeking investment, and specifically in the semiconductor area. So I do believe that Taiwan was one of the important factors that figured in Chinese thinking, but of course that was not the primary factor. The primary factor was, of course, the US. And then if you look at the optics that we are seeing emerging out of the BRICS summit, I really, of course, even though there were 9 leaders, but the photos that I have seen are just of Prime Minister Modi with the Russian president and Chinese president. So this idea that India is also on our side is very much being projected from both Chinese and Russian side. So the projection of BRICS as an anti-West grouping by Russia as well as China is something that we are seeing in the past 2 days. But if you look at India's stand, it's just that it's a non-Western organization. This is also one of the reasons why India has been quoted by both China and Russia.
Swasti, perception will be that this is an anti-Western alliance because BRICS, because China is driving it, Russia is hosting it, and China and Russia are now all-weather allies, right? It's kept on changing for the past 70 years, but now they are, at this point, they are all-weather allies. And they also have others joining in, North Korea, Iran, Pezeshkian was present here as well. How does India balance this? Because India has to balance Russia, China, and the US in the Western world. Where are India's larger interests? Is India balancing it well? And what is your best case scenario for India to navigate through this?
Now, so very quickly, I mean, just to build on what Sana was saying, that, I mean, I don't think India would be naive enough to sort of play into this narrative that, okay, so India was falling too much into the Western lap, and then just by giving a little concession on the LAC, we are trying to re-engage India. I don't think that's happening, because I don't care about the larger political discourse, and we all have different kind of opinions on that. But if you really look at how our defense procurement has evolved, I think it's very, very clear that in September, the MOD had also released something which was to the tune of cleansing the Indian defense equipment of Chinese components. So I think we are taking a very serious view of where our procurement is going to come from. And that's also one of the reasons why we have not really placed any new order with Russia after the war in Ukraine has begun, because even though we are engaging Russia and we are obviously getting the orders which were placed in 2016 and 2018, etc., but we are not placing new orders because now that Russia is cut off from Western tech, we know that Russia is going to get pushed further with Chinese technology, and then that is something for which the scenario remains very fuzzy. So what I'm saying is that I don't think anybody in India is that naive, especially when it comes to the defense procurements. Now, with respect to your question, when it comes to BRICS, well, I think the short answer is that India is in BRICS so that it doesn't become a completely anti-Western alliance. Because minus India, I'm not talking about the.
If I may interrupt you, you are endorsing what Sana is saying, being the perception from the Chinese side.
Well, that's true.
That India, in a way, is a moderating force in BRICS.
I mean, India is Okay, so when, I was recently speaking to the Chinese on the BRICS expansion, and this was something which was put together by a German foundation and all that. So I think when we hear the Chinese, their perception is that India has completely fallen into the US lap, and India is doing all aggressive things in the Southeast Asia, and India is selling BrahMos to Philippines and all that. So it's bringing about that very that instability. So from Chinese perspective, they do somewhere see that India is tilting too much towards US. When it comes to BRICS, I think it's very clear that there's just so much. The BRICS doesn't have a common economic vision. I mean, what really is BRICS? It was a term which was given by a Western
Goldman Sachs
economist.
Goldman Sachs researcher.
And this is way back in the late 90s, early 2000s. Okay, at that time the geopolitics was very different. It was like, okay, these are the countries that will eventually become the power engines, etc. But if you look carefully, BRICS does not have a common vision. BRICS is not a strategic grouping. BRICS is a loose grouping for countries that wish to put together a kind of a new world economic order. Now, the definition of this new world economic order is a problem because China sees it as China-led with Chinese characteristics. Russia is simply anti-Western in that regard, especially after what has happened in Ukraine. And from India's perspective, India believes in economic multipolarity, and India believes in sort of a new world economic order in global south. But frankly, today's India's economic interests lie with the West. I mean, today our biggest trade, our technological, cooperation, our defense industry cooperation, the three big players are the US, France, and Israel. And the rest of the list, if you go through, whether it's Germany, whether it's
now the Germans
Japan,
are in town. It's all just coming in. Germans are in town trying to sell India submarines. Their new tank. Their cutting-edge surface-to-air missiles. It's the same Germany that refused to sell India what I might call the equivalent of tamanchas today. That is MP5 submachine guns for our special forces, because they said they'll be used against civilians.
But that shows how geopolitics has changed. So I think part of this puzzle is to really understand how geopolitics has evolved, and why is it that India's pitch in the BRICS is, for example, is to make sure that it remains non-Western. Because as far as things are non-Western, it's fine, it's kosher. How can the West imagine that it is going to have a say in every single grouping of the world?
If India is not there, it could easily lapse into being anti-Western.
Yes, why? Because one has to understand very clearly that today, when you say the combined heft of the BRICS GDP or the economies, you are basically talking about the Chinese economy, right? And that is the reason, why a BRICS currency will never see the light of day, no matter how popular it remains as a sentiment in the global south.
Only on Twitter.
Mostly on Twitter, yes.
X. I can't get myself to say X, I apologize. That sounds not very good.
Yeah, because India would never do anything that actually strengthens the Chinese grip on de-dollarized trade. It is absolutely against India's interest. So BRICS currency will not work, of course. BRICS, as like I said, the economic vision is a problem. There is one silver lining though with BRICS, which is the new development bank and the contingency reserve arrangement, and that actually makes it so attractive for a lot of other countries to apply for, because the new development bank as an instrument for loaning has done some decent job. And the good thing about it is its resilience, because in order to get its loans, you don't really have to be a member of the BRICS, because BRICS doesn't really have like a rules and regulation kind of an organizational structure yet. So that is something which is very, I think, legit. I think it makes sense for countries to get together and try to develop mechanisms on trade in local currencies. But to connect it to de-dollarization or to connect it to some kind of a BRICS currency, I mean, it's a very childish argument, because the data doesn't support it. I mean, the Chinese currency, as well as the UAE's dirhams, they remain pegged to the US dollar. So it's a very childish. I think we really need to have some more educated, discussions on this, about to what extent is it a political sentiment.
If I change the direction of this discussion and they said, no, de-dollarization. Now, Putin wants de-dollarization. What a wonderful idea. And I could get both of you to agree. This would be watched by several million people, because everybody wants a dollar, but everybody wants the dollar to disappear. And when I ask them what will happen when dollar disappears, it will be yuan. Maybe not, maybe yes. So there is an issue there. Sana, the Chinese. The Chinese don't see themselves as an anti-Western force, because Chinese have a strong stake in the West. Wouldn't they like to normalize their relationship with the West, because their whole economy is built on the West?
No, as in absolutely, specifically when it comes to bilateral interactions, I think China is as globalized as any other country. But when it comes to a multilateral or regional organization, specifically where Russia is present, China becomes all anti-West. And even if you look at, and I feel that I want to build on what Swasti also said about BRICS being non-West in India's perspective on that. And I do believe that India is the only reason why organizations such as SCO and BRICS are not anti-West. And while I was researching on my BRICS piece, Chinese discourse, I actually came across a lot of articles, Chinese analysts talking about India's place in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And, in India, we have this narrative that India was the only country who opposed Belt and Road Initiative. And India is the only country who didn't have its name in the joint statement when it comes to endorsing Belt and Road Initiative. But when I read the Chinese discourse, one of the main arguments was that rest of the countries were on Chinese side, and India was the only country that wasn't on the Chinese side. So India is a disruptor, not just in BRICS, not just in SCO. And I think this also stems from the idea that India's presence in all these organizations is equal to, it's a neutral organization. It's an organization that focuses on real issues. So if you look at it, Chinese and Russian perspective about SCO, BRICS were primarily anti-West, that these are the countries that are presenting something that are in contrast to Western-led global order, that are challenging the ideas of West. But India has been very consistent with the idea that we are going to discuss issues such as resilience, developmental issues, infrastructure, climate change. But so I do believe there is definitely divergence of interest, divergence of outlook when it comes to India and when it comes to China. And I do believe this is one of the reasons why this non Western or anti West organization, this debate is very important, because how China is presenting itself, how China is presenting its role within the organization versus how India is actually practicing and exercising what it believes in and what it preaches.
So, in fact, if you look at BRICS, the point that both of you have made, say the policy on Israel, if India wasn't there, the policy on Israel could be very different, because the two strongest critics of Israel, besides Iran, the two strongest critics are Brazil and South Africa. And both of them are present in BRICS. And Russia has its own anti-Western game, and Israel is seen as a kind of eastern flank of the Western world, right? And the Chinese themselves could play with it. So to that extent, India is also a moderating factor there, because President of Iran is present as an invitee.
Well, I mean, when it comes to, say, West Asia, for example, you just mentioned, I mean, if you look at as long as the Ukraine war was not there, and as long as, I mean, even when the Ukraine war started, we saw that Israel was actually playing a balancing game, okay? In fact, I wrote a column on that, as, Israel's balancing is also a masterclass, Turkey's balancing is a masterclass. But all of that actually went out of the window once Hamas attack happened, and once Israel really took this very strong response when it came to weakening the axis of Hezbollah, Hamas, and Houthis. It's very, very clear. Russia, they have also bombed not directly the Russian bases, but all the weapons that were stocked near the Russian bases in Syria.
I believe they have a liaison system at Latakia, where when they're going to bomb a base where Russians are present, they tell them 5 minutes ahead. So Russians get their personnel out of the way.
Okay, but the thing is that it's very clear, and you also see that lately President Putin has also affirmed that he stands behind Iran, and right now it's an existential thing, because he's getting his drones from Iran, all the Shahed drones that have been so important in the war. Not just that, also missiles that he's been getting from Iran, what all he gets from North Korea. So it's very clear that Russia is incapable of fighting this war on its own, minus Chinese dual-use technology, minus the Iranian drones. Now they're making their own, but it'll take some time, minus the North Korean ammunition, and now perhaps also North Korean soldiers, 12,000 of them, as per reports, are there. So I think, yes, to some extent, I agree that India is a bit of a balancer out there, because India has very genuine interest with Israel. But long story short, I do feel that on the one hand, I agree that right now, because the world is in such a flux, and the entire global order seems completely upended. So it makes sense for India to keep its options open, and that is why I say that this is a commonsensical approach to the world. And that is why you see so many middle order countries treading the same path, which is that, okay, keep your options open. But that is the primary reason for why India must keep its option open, and why it should be looking at more collaborative frameworks. But end of the day, if push came to shove, I think India should need to have what I would call like a national commitment to what its security. I'm sure it is there, but we need to also somewhere accelerate our procurement, our internal so to say all the reforms that we require.
First of all, we have to up our defense budget.
Yeah, true. Up our defense budget.
Modi government inherited a defense budget, a history of defense budget, sub 2% of GDP.
Yes, that's right.
Say 1.7, 1.8, between that. And then second, 2 steps away from the decimal, it's been declining. So 1.78 becomes 1.76, 1.76 becomes 1.72% of GDP. That's not good enough.
No, that's not good enough. And also because we have, this the pension problem and all the logistics. I think when it only comes to taking quick decisions in good time so that we get the value for money, I think we need to get more professional.
So Sana, have you seen the Chinese take notice of India's defense and military, or talk about what's lacking there and what is it that India needs? But in their own, have they drawn their own lessons from it?
I think they consider themselves superior, because this is one thing that comes up in the discourse, that India is not doing enough, and China, and there is no way that India could actually match up with the Chinese. And there's this kind of ridicule on the Chinese internet as well, that India has these aspirations to become a leading power. But I do believe it all comes out primarily because of what importance India has been getting. This happened in the 1940s, 1950s as well, when India started getting attention at a global stage. So I don't think much has been changed with respect to that. No, and then I still believe that somewhere they still see India as an inferior partner, inferior country than Chinese. But despite that, there is recognition that India is a different India. India of today is very different. There is a new India that they have to tackle with, they have to deal with. And specifically with this Narendra Modi administration, this is something that the Chinese do not really know how to deal with. That, of course, I think this is just a part of forming a narrative that India has to spend more, even and India is a poor country. Even though if they're doing it, they cannot really match up with what the Chinese has been doing. But I do believe it's just a part of forming this narrative that we are superior. So our adversary, our main competitor is the US. India comes nowhere near that. But I do believe that India is definitely a country that is causing a lot of stress, a lot of tension among the Chinese policy circle as well as strategic community as
because
well.
what's happened in this case is, and that's my view, that while we keep talking of Indo-Pacific and focus seems to be naval, the fact is that on ground, on land, India has kept nearly 100,000 Chinese troops busy, engaged,
Yes.
with so much armor, so much artillery, so much air power, so much of air assets have had to be shifted to Tibet, that if all this was available to the Chinese, maybe their view of Taiwan would have been different. Or at least the fear for Taiwan might have been different. So to that extent, India is the only power currently, I won't say aligned with the West, but currently friends with the West, that is actually staring down the Chinese and keeping them busy and engaged.
Well, I mean, just my quick sense, it's very obvious and it's a very good point actually. But just my two quick sense is that, I think today, it really suits the West's interests to have a partner like India that is not clearly in an alliance system with them. I think the West, and this has happened in the last 2 years, 3 years of the Ukraine war. Initially, we saw there was so much pressure, and that was taken very badly in India. India really snubbed the West over this differing perception and all that. So India was very critical of West putting pressure on it to take a stand, etc. But in the last 2-3 years, we have seen that the conversation has evolved very well. And whatever sense that I have made out of my meetings, here and there, and all the, in the last 2-3 years, I think today it really suits the West interest to have a non-aligned India, because it's like then India is very much a part of all these other alternative groupings where the West doesn't really have either any legitimacy or any outreach. So I think this is something which they would prefer, that there's more merit in having an India like that. As far as keeping China engaged, well, I'm not sure. I think Sana would perhaps be the right person to say how much of that was a real diversion when it comes to China. But yes, for sure, because see, the Chinese way of fighting a war is also very proxy. They have an immense cognitive warfare. They have immense cyber capabilities. They have a different approach to when it comes to space and militarizing space. They have a different approach when it comes to militarizing and weaponizing resources that probably normal people would not think of. So I'm not very sure to what extent was it really a genuine, so to say, diversion. But I'm sure it was some diversion, and I'm sure this was welcomed by the West. But like I said, that the number of people is not reducing, so that there is no de-escalation, not yet.
Not yet.
So I think in that regard, perhaps
No.
yes,
And China also has a proxy, that proxy is a nuclear armed proxy. That's
Pakistan, of course.
That's Pakistan.
Yeah.
So, Sana, from where would China like to go from here vis-a-vis India?
I think both sides they do not really have a lot of expectations. And even if you look at the statement that just came immediately after the meeting, it's all rosy words. And it's not something concrete. And this is not something that we have to be very happy about. It's good that the meeting has happened, but the relations have stabilized. But the relation still somewhat remains abnormal, in my opinion. So how do we and where do we go from here? We have no idea. The details, content have not been made public yet, and I am not even sure if the details have been discussed yet. The idea was just to have a meeting so that they could just say that Prime Minister Modi has met Chinese President Xi Jinping. So I do believe that it's good that it is getting the attention that it deserves. But in terms of outcome, in terms of the prospects of India-China relation, I'm not very hopeful, because even if something happens in the next 1 or 2 years, for example, there is no standoff. China is all like, I'm going to engage with you. We have to engage with China, India, and Russia, and we have to form this anti-Western coalition. It doesn't matter, because after 3 years, what we are going to see is another standoff. Because if you look at it from 1950, specifically from the 1980s, after the restoration of ambassadorial relations, and even after the visit of then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, nothing has changed. But what has changed now is India's approach towards China. We are not just taking it lightly. If there is a standoff, we are giving a befitting reply. So I do believe that there will be a standoff, because the border dispute is, as I said, it's not about territory. It's about keeping India under a check. It's about keeping India preoccupied. And mentioned about Pakistan, the ironclad friendship, brother, is just for show. It's just symbolism. We know that Pakistan is important for China only and only because of India. So Pakistan border dispute is just a part of keeping India preoccupied. So I'm not very optimistic with respect to the border dispute resolution. And my point is that if China could resolve the border dispute with 12 countries, why not with India? I do understand. Of course, I don't really believe there's a differing perception of the LAC. That argument has already been discarded by the Indian side. But I do understand that that involves a lot of negotiation with population living at both sides of the LAC. There are a lot of issues, and it will be very difficult to sell any kind of resolution to both the Chinese as well as Indians. But if China could do it with 12 countries, I do believe it could also do with India. So the willingness is absent, and the willingness to treat India as an equal partner is definitely absent from the Chinese side. And I do not think that we could take any offer that does not really align with our interest.
And we can't take China for granted. We can't think that China now thinks, oh, India is a rising power. We have to keep them happy. It's not like that.
Absolutely. And then I don't think that China is actually thinking about India's status or India as a rising power, and we have to engage with India. India has been an important player in the global order for at least 10 years, if not 20, 25 years. So I don't think China's approach towards India is going to change. And then nothing much has changed on ground, as I said already. So I do believe that this is just optics. This was very important, and this is definitely a diplomatic victory for Xi Jinping, specifically when the US election is just in less than 2 weeks. So I do believe that it's just an idea that whatever happens with the US, let's just try to calm tensions with India. I still do not see that China thinks that India is as important as perhaps the US. India is going to be an adversary for China, and we have already accepted that a primary security threat comes from China. As in, I don't believe that this has changed because of this meeting or this approach, this idea, the threat perception has changed overnight, and even China's approaches has changed.
Actually, even if you say Pakistan is a threat thanks to China.
Yes.
So as we say in Hindi, hathi ke pav mein sabka pav, right? So once you say China, you count China's proxies as well. And Pakistan by itself can't be any bit of a threat, because all of the Pakistani hardware now, more or less,
Yes,
happens to be
Not
Chinese.
Just, by the way, that's another part, which is that China has been the major arms exporter to both Pakistan and Bangladesh. Okay, and this is all to the tune of 90% or so. It could be some percentage points higher somewhere, but it's all, I think in the case of Pakistan, it's even higher. So it's also this. It's a fairly serious matter.
So Swasti, now we're coming towards the conclusion.
Okay.
So we've talked about this balancing of multiple forces in this very rapidly changing world. What kind of overhang do you think will this intelligence issue have over this? You wrote a column on that, so we'll share both columns from Swasti as well as Sana with you. Please read those. Those give you a perspective from different parts of the world, and both are very, very perceptive, and both are, if I may say so, quite brave as well. Because these days, you tend to, a lot of the columnists and journalists tend to just speak from a script, from one side or the other, or speak from ignorance, because this is what suits them, right? It's the same thing. A dollar is in decline, America is in decline. If I see the latest Economist, it tells me that the American economy, instead of being in decline, is actually much
Doing
stronger.
better, much stronger.
It was 40% of its alliance, Western alliance. Now it's 50%. So actually, it's growing beyond. It's subsuming the European economic power. It's becoming much bigger than that. So वो सब छोड़ने के बाद में, you tell me, how much of an overhang is it going to be?
So very quickly, I mean, we all know that the very reason that India has had a different approach when it came to Canada versus when it is about US is also because it also kind of reflects which is a more important partner to us, and which partner really took it in a way that is acceptable diplomatically. So I think part of that is just a reiteration that in Canada the biggest problem was the way Trudeau handled it, versus in the US it was done in a much more mature and pragmatic manner. Now in terms of the overhang, well, I do believe that this is something, it should not really be a major issue. I think the legal proceedings and the legal procedure will take its course, and this will not be affected much regardless of who's in office, right? I mean, like we were just mentioning that if Donald Trump really had, there's another problem in India, that there's another thing that if Donald Trump were to become an American president, then it is going to be a very good situation for India and everything will be set right, and it's just the Democrats that. I don't think it's like that. If Donald Trump really had that kind of a power, he's himself facing so many cases. Okay, so I think so very quickly, I think the legal course is going to run. Okay, I mean that is going to happen.
I know. If I may interrupt, if Donald Trump was going to have such a leverage over Department of Justice,
he'll
sort out his own cases first. His own cases first.
True. So I don't think that is going to happen like that, and that is also somewhere a bit of I would say ignorance perhaps, or a lack of a systematic analysis on how these institutions really function in countries such as the US. And that is a kind of, and that's why I've been arguing that we have to develop that strategic communication. I mean, for some reason, we have to also understand that in a partnership, right, just as much as you would want the other side to understand your anxieties, your preferences, your history, I think it pretty much applies to us as well, that, that you are dealing with a country where you have these different voices and you have to develop a kind of a strategic pragmatism and communication to actually engage that. But despite that, though, this will carry on. In the case of Canada, of course, we here, believe that if, Trudeau would lose the elections, perhaps it would be a new era. But again, it is going to be dependent on how pragmatically the two sides actually engage. However, I think in the case of Canada, we can still say that Canada is not really that indispensable for India. In the case of US, I guess the larger convergence in Indo-Pacific will continue. The larger convergence on defense industry will also continue. And if at all we understand the kind of, not just the political investment, strategic investment, defense investment, the Western powers that as a whole are making towards Indo-Pacific, it is very clear that that convergence is going to trump over these little problems.
And Sana, Swasti says that there is a multiplicity of forces. These are multi-layered societies and power systems. You don't have any such problem in China. It's just a one-man show, isn't it?
Well, also in Russia, for example.
Or Russia, but China in particular, or does China also have different levels of power or complexities in its system?
No, absolutely. There are protests in China. There are issues, but these are mostly tackled at the provincial level. So, of course, and we definitely heard specifically when there was COVID zero policy in China, there were resentment, there were calls for Xi Jinping to step down after what happened. So, but the thing is that we don't get to hear about it. It's all censored on the internet. We don't get to see what's actually happening in China.
But at the policy level, say in the military commission, in the Politburo, are there different voices?
I think as of now, specifically in China, it's all about Xi Jinping, and specifically how we are seeing that we are sitting now and then the next minute we are hearing the news of foreign minister gone. And we still have no idea where the serving foreign minister has gone. As in, it can't happen in any other country. Of course, there was some opposition to Xi Jinping, but then those people are, not in the party anymore. Either they have died or have just gone missing. This is what has happened in China. So I am definitely sensing that it's all about Xi Jinping as of now in China. And even if there is any resentment, even if there are protests within the party, within the Politburo with respect to Xi Jinping, it might not come on surface, not in the near future.
Okay, on that note, I will just ask you both for a two-sentence comment each. Who do you prefer 2 weeks from now in the US? Kamala Harris or Trump? So, Sana, you first. And why? And why?
And then I think it's a very difficult question. And also, I feel that the election is not going to impact me personally. So I don't have a personal preference for that. But I think if I just talk from foreign policy perspective with respect to both Taiwan or perhaps China or India, all these countries, all these places have got bipartisan support that we need to support Taiwan. We need to have good relations with India. So this is not going to change no matter who comes to power. So I do believe that I do not have any preference with respect to who wins in the US. It's definitely going to be business as usual for both Taiwan as well as India, and to some extent for China as well.
Swasti?
So, well, yes, a very difficult question again, because, let's say I don't really have a personal favorite. I mean, Trump is not liked for his own reason, and Kamala Harris, and she has her own reasons. I think it's for the American people to decide, frankly. But when it comes to India, I would like to just fine tune the argument a little bit, which is that, yes, there is a bipartisan support, a consensus in the US when it comes to supporting India, and especially the Indo-Pacific. In fact, that's what I mentioned in the Five Eyes column also, that in 2019, there was a committee that said that Five Eyes should also pivot, to Indo-Pacific and engage with Japan and India and South Korea if the US pivot to Indo-Pacific has to work. So that's one. But the one thing that we perhaps don't discuss enough is that right now we are in a trade surplus with the US. And with Trump back, we are going to miss out on that because he's going to make trade more protectionist. So that is something which is not really in India's favor. And then, we perhaps don't really discuss that too much. We just have this assessment that if Trump were to come, there will be a more powerful leader, perhaps, or somebody who
maybe we'll get less of the lecturing.
Less of lecturing. Yes, so maybe there is a trade-off: less of lecturing versus less of trade. I think trade is important, but frankly, my last point would be that I think right now what we should be looking at, out of all this, whatever is happening, is that there is a very serious China plus one diversification which is underway, right? I mean, decoupling is not possible. But if you look at the US, they are trying to diversify away from China, de-risking. Europe is de-risking from China. And they are looking at India in a big way. The problem is that India is not able to make use of that China plus one diversification because of the problems with our investment ecosystem, etc. So I think those are things that we should be working on. By and large, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, it is not really going to impact too much. But, just my fingers are crossed about the trade.
So a world full of challenges. At the same time, it's a bit like there's a lot of opportunity. The lights turn green. You can move on. But if you wait too long, if you get caught in indecision, it will turn red again. And if it's a light under the building where I work, it may take another 28 minutes for it to come back on. So that's why when an opportunity comes,
for you.
when an opportunity comes, you must take it. And to understand these twists and turns and complexities, thank you very much, both of you, wonderful young scholars. Strategic scholarship was for too long a male domain. And I'm so glad that people like you are not only challenging it, but doing it very successfully. So thank you very much for being here. You've enriched this discussion. I've learned a lot, and I think we should be doing it more often. So thank you, Sana. It's quite late for you, I know, in Taiwan. And thank you, Swasti.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure meeting you, Sana. Thank you.